Hebert. I work on the Southeast Asia program here at CSIS. It's a delight to welcome all of you here, especially for this auspicious occasion when we have His Excellency Jose Ramos Horta, who I think everybody in the room knows, but I'll introduce very briefly. In December last year, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon announced that he was appointing Mr. Ramos Horta to become his special representative and head of the UN Integrated Peacekeeping Office in Guinea-Bissau. Mr. Ramos Horta is a recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in 1996, and that was in response to his decades of work for East Timor's independence and peace and political stability and economic development. He served as president of Timor-Leste from 2007 to 2012. Before that, he served as prime minister, and before that as foreign minister. So he's had a lot of key posts. He hasn't been finance minister yet, I guess, but just kidding. So it's a delight, Your Excellency, to welcome you to CSIS. He's going to speak for about 25, 30 minutes or so, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. Thank you. Please.
It's a great pleasure to be here again in CSIS in Washington. I'm on a different official capacity, but unavoidably I will talk a bit about experiences in Asia in dealing with peacemaking, and then I obviously will do my duty, update you on my new responsibilities in Guinea-Bissau. In September last year, in Bangkok, soon after I left office, myself, former Deputy Prime Minister, Foreign Minister of Thailand, Dr. Surakirt, former Vice President of Indonesia, Yusuf Kala, former Foreign Minister of Indonesia, Hassan Wirajuda, former Deputy Prime Minister, Foreign Minister of Singapore, Jayakumar, great eminent international law professor, former Speaker of Philippine Congress, Jose de Venecia, former Prime Minister of Pakistan, Dr. Aziz, former Prime Minister of Malaysia, Badawi, and many others from Asia region. We gather following months of different discussions in Timor-Leste and elsewhere to set up an organization called Asian Peace and Reconciliation Council. If you look at do a review of the literature throughout Asia, you don't find a single organization, civic base, that deals with second-track diplomacy, offering ideas, solutions to conflicts in Asia, particularly one with former leaders with regional and international authority and expertise and influence, because some of the former leaders, like Yusuf Kala, still carry enormous influence in his own country. He's actually now busy spearheading a group dealing with the Rohingya problem in Myanmar. We set up the group in answering to many of us question, where are Asians leaders in living up to our collective responsibility in addressing the many challenges that the Asia region face. We hear optimistic assertions about the rising Asia. Yes, obviously Asia has been rising from 50 years, 40 years ago of extreme poverty in China and elsewhere to where today you can say the largest concentration maybe of liquidity is in Asia. The largest concentration probably of wealth is in Asia. But Asia also is home to the percentage of poor people in the world. 60% of the world poor are in Asia. 40%, 50% of the world population is in Asia, but 60% of the world poor are in Asia. But Asia is also the most nuclearized region of the world, not in terms of quantity of nuclear weapons, but in terms of countries possessing nuclear weapons. And many in Asia think that there are shortcuts to superpower status. Why bother going through the route of the United States? You first develop education, infrastructure, strong economy, then a strong army, and then maybe nuclear weapons. In Asia, there are some who think there are shortcuts to superpower status. You don't have to resolve issues of extreme poverty, lack of access to clean water, lack of access to education, go straight, shortcut by having nuclear weapons. That's the case of Pakistan, the case of India, but worse than that is the case of North Korea. So that is, and unlike in Europe, where you have two nuclear powers, UK and France, they don't point nuclear weapons at each other. They used to point them at Soviet Union. Now no longer Soviet Union exists, so they don't know where to point it, so it's frozen somewhere. And the Latin Americans, they had the wisdom not to go for the nuclear arms race. Africa, also the same. But in Asia, many people seem to love nuclear weapons because it assures superpower status without having to resolve other fundamental problems. You have India, nuclear weapons pointing at their cousins, brothers, and sisters from Pakistan, and vice versa. And of course, India's nuclear weapons pointing at China. Chinese nuclear weapons pointing at India and at the United States. North Korea with nuclear weapons pointing at everybody. And at South Korea, at Japan, at the United States, as you have read, and etc. Probably the only country they have not pointed nuclear weapons at is China. Then there are other almost intractable, insurmountable border disputes. Almost every country in Asia has border disputes that led to wars in past. And today, one of the issues that my organization, our organization, Asian Peace Reconciliation Council, dealing with is the South China Sea disputes. We had a recent trip to Beijing. I wasn't part of it because it was impossible to reconcile my commitments in West Africa and having to rush to Beijing for that meeting, although the Chinese side, my colleagues, insisted that I be part of it. And the Chinese side welcome our idea, which we have to sell to everybody else, the claimant states in the South China Sea dispute, on rather than trying to address the issue of the maritime boundary claims and counterclaims, focus on joint development in the area. And that's where the Chinese side prefer. Next June, we will be going to the Philippines to discuss with the Philippines. For that particular meeting, I probably will go because of my personal relations with Filipinos, but also because it coincides with my holidays. I now no longer criticize UN holidays. In the past, I noticed they have so many holidays, and now I totally support it because they come very handy. So in June, I plan my holiday to go back to my country, but also to join the meetings in the Philippines. The other issue that I was the one who raised in that meeting that we must pay attention to is Afghanistan post-2014, post-US NATO withdrawal. because I also often said and castigate my brothers and sisters in Asia. People always too ready to criticize Americans, less the Europeans, for whatever things that go wrong in Afghanistan. But no one else is trying to do anything to diffuse the problems in Afghanistan. Asian commitment to Afghanistan is very limited. If you do body counting in terms of number of troops from Asian countries there, or development assistance, or peacemaking initiatives, extremely minute when you look at the size of economies of Asia and so on. And US and NATO will leave. And the problem will not have been solved because of, we know, the complexity, intractability of the challenges in Afghanistan. But Asian leaders have to accept the responsibility and try to do something about it. Maybe where the Soviets fail, NATO and Americas might fail. We don't know yet what will be the outcome in 2014. Maybe diplomacy, Asian diplomacy will succeed. We will see. What is important is that we must do something about it. And when our group was in Beijing, I wasn't there, I said, the Chinese said, please do something about Afghanistan. And these are only some of the challenges that Asia face. In about 3 years ago, when Prime Minister Hatoyama was, Prime Minister, I was still president. I had a state visit to Japan and had 2 hours with him. And very, very fruitful conversation. Followed an initiative that I took with the then president of Maldives, Nasheed, who is no longer president. Hatoyama is no longer prime minister, to persuade Asian leaders to take up an initiative on climate change and sustainable development. After the failures of Copenhagen, I was the only head of state who didn't bother going to Copenhagen because I knew there would be no reaching agreement. And Copenhagen was a very expensive city. I didn't want there to go just to spend money. And it was right, complete failure. The other 2 following meetings in Mexico and Durban, the same. And sitting with Nasheed, I said, no, we must, as the 2 smallest countries in Asia, we must encourage leaders in Asia to have an Asian initiative on climate change and sustainable development. Enough of pointing fingers at the Americans and Europeans for pollution, for environmental degradation over the past 100 years. Because Asians itself, by the sheer pressure on the land because of its population, has responsibilities. We all extract something from nature. Just the survival of a human being in Asia because of the population pressure, that brings us responsibilities, apart from the industrialization of India and China and everybody else. And it's no point continuing engaging in the blame game. Today, Asia is different from what it was 50 years ago. It has resources, manpower, know-how, scientists, and it has liquidity. So why not an Asian roadmap, an Asian vision on climate change and sustainable development? Mobilize something like $100 billion spread over 10 years, focusing on tree planting, putting back the trees, the hundreds of millions of trees that we took from the land, cleaning up the lakes, the rivers, the seas, restock the fish that have been depleted by Asians, by the voracious appetites for seafood in Hong Kong, Shanghai restaurants, and in Japan. You know, I advise Japanese friends, why for a few years, don't you all become vegetarians and stop killing dolphins and whales? The Japanese didn't appreciate that advice. Well, Hatoyama, I told Hatoyama, because you recall he was elected around the same time as Barack Obama. And in Japan, he enjoyed talking about how similar they are, about same age. And I told him, you have a unique opportunity to change, to effect changes, particularly in your relationship, Japan's relationship with Korea and China. You people have to get over World War II. And that is a two-way street or three-way street, meaning the Japanese have to take additional steps to pacify the Chinese who have legitimate grievances, and vice versa. The Chinese side also have to stop. Every time there is some political, economic, trade disagreement with Japan, they bring up World War II. And Hatoyama, he said, I have instructed my staff to really look and see how we can dynamize relations with China and Korea. But in Japan, prime ministers don't last more than 1 year. Hatoyama lasted even less. So by the time, and I continued the rounds, in Singapore with Prime Minister Lee, with President Susilo Mavedion. And in the meantime, few of the leaders I talked to were ousted. I was with Kevin Rudd in Australia. Australia never had a coup in 200 years of history. Well, I met with Kevin Rudd. He was Prime Minister, and he was the darling of the climate change fight. He became a star in the Bali conference. I was there on a state visit. He knew I like port, Portuguese port wine, so he invited me to his official residence one evening to meet and have port. I noticed he was always on the phone, and the people around were on the phone. There was some tension in the air. Well, somewhere else in the town, they were backstabbing him. And the next day, he hosted an official lunch for me in the parliament. By afternoon, he was overthrown in a bloodless coup. And yeah, you're familiar with that. No? So, well, the last casualty was Nasheed of Maldives. That's why Barack Obama doesn't want to see me. Because he knows, I met him briefly in New York twice, 4 years ago, 3 years ago. And he knows of my record in causing. Someone suggested, why don't you go to North Korea? So I wanted with this just to introduce you the Asian Peace and Reconciliation Council. We are a new organization, started in September with some exceptional, talented, gifted people. Professor Jayakumar, foreign minister of Singapore for many years, eminent international law professor. He's the one in charge of our task force dealing with South China. And I'm the one in charge of the task force on Burma. But I'm not very active at the moment because of my new responsibilities. And we look for partnerships with experts. For one of the Harvard professor, Paul Kennedy, is one of our advisors. And we look for a technical partnership with think tanks, because we do not wish to have to reinvent the wheel. If we need research on a particular area, there are so many expert bodies that can do that. So having said that, I turn now to GuineaBissau, because I agree talk only for half hour to In October, but first let me say, in August, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon was in my country. I was no longer president at the time, and I told the Secretary General, please pay attention to the problem of the Rohingya in Myanmar, Burma. And I told him, normally, traditionally, the Secretary General has to consult with parties involved, countries, government, before he appoints a special envoy or a special representative. And I said, well, in the case of Myanmar, you don't have to consult anyone, because the Myanmar authorities do not recognize Rohingya as a people there. And the Bangladesh side is uncomfortable about it. So you could go ahead and appoint. I don't know whether he has done that. I don't think that. There is a special advisor to the Secretary General for Myanmar. He's not a special representative. His title is Special Advisor. And then around October, November, I was approached whether I would be interested to be a special representative of the Secretary General in Guinea-Bissau. I accepted with some hesitation. The hesitation had to do with the Asian Peace and Reconciliation Council. Some of my colleagues, like Dr. Surakiat, initially he said, please don't, we are just starting, we need you here. But later they all congratulated and relented. And why I accepted the challenge? Similar challenges that we face in Timor-Leste, in nation building, peace building, healing wounds, rebuilding the country, building the state institutions. Guinea-Bissau is a typical case of failures of political leadership, international disengagement, lack of it is not a country that